If you were to think about a diamond has many facets that make its beauty come out. You see, back when I was about to propose to my wife, I have a friend who cuts diamond for a living. And he told me that the main thing people often look at is the size of the diamond. But then I learned from him the most important part of the diamond is how the diamond is cut. The more angles and facets there are to a diamond, then the more the diamond will shine from a light. And in the same way, the way we see the beauty of God is by looking at his multifaceted character, mainly revealed through his covenants. And so here's the main point for this lesson. God's character is primarily revealed through the way he establishes and fulfills his covenants. At this point, before we continue, it's important for you to download the PDF documents that we will be going over together so that you can fill it out as I go over each covenant. Let's start with the Noahic Covenant. First, let's look at the context. God sent a worldwide flood because of mankind's corruption and sin. To preserve mankind, God saved Noah and his family from this flood by having him build an ark. After the flood, God promised that he would preserve both mankind and this earth with this covenant. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is a sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. Now we know from the previous lesson that this covenant reveals God's mercy. Why do I say that? Because the problem of sin was never solved through this flood. So technically, God could have kept judging every generation of people with the worldwide flood, but because of his covenant, God says that he will never again destroy mankind and this earth with the flood. In fact, God not only promised mankind, but all the animals of the earth. And so typically, a covenant is accompanied with a sign. For example, when a couple gets married, the sign of their covenant is their wedding ring. It is a symbol that reminds them about the conditions of their covenant. And so God gives a sign to us to remind us that he will never again send another worldwide flood. And do you remember what the sign is? A rainbow. By the way, a rainbow requires water droplets to be floating in the air. This is why you see them after it rains, because the clouds need to be cleared away from the sun in order for a rainbow to appear. So literally a rainbow tells us that a storm has stopped, which points back to this covenant that God would never allow a worldwide flood to destroy this earth. Now we know what this covenant promises and the sign of this covenant. But how long would this covenant last? God gives the answer. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And so we see that this covenant is an everlasting covenant, meaning that as long as there is an earth, God will not destroy it. Now here's the thing about this covenant. The Noahic covenant connects back to the creation account because this covenant is God's way of quote-unquote starting over with his restoration plan on earth. Theologians have called this covenant the beginning steps of God's restoration plan. Now, what is the restoration plan? Good question. Look at what the apostle said in Acts chapter 3, verse 21. Whom heaven must receive until the time for restoring all the things about which God spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets long ago. If you look back at Genesis chapter 3, you see that this earth has been cursed by sin. And because of sin, this earth will not produce fruit despite our labors. So God promises that through a future seed of Eve, he will be the one to reverse the curse on this earth by restoring it back to God's original design. We see that Lamech, Noah's father, thought that he would be the one who will restore God's earth and fulfill God's prophecy from Genesis chapter 3. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. We see this concept of God recreating creation even before the flood. You see, when God commands Noah to build an ark, the word ark is actually an Egyptian word that is translated in Hebrew. Now keep in mind that the author of Genesis is Moses, and Moses was raised with the Egyptian education. And so let's look at what Moses is trying to communicate by using an Egyptian word for ark in Hebrew. Now, an ark is not a boat. It's not the way we picture a boat with sails or a rudder, but the dimensions of this ark was actually a box. In fact, the word ark in Egyptian usually referred to a shrine for an idol or even a coffin. Many of these shrines were made from wood, where it was a long rectangle chest with a small door in the upper portion of the front, so that this place can be reserved for the statues of the different gods, and it was about the size of a child. Now, such shrines or arks were found in Egyptian temples. During certain festivals, these shrines or arks floated on the Nile from one temple town to another as a way to transport the gods. In fact, the same word is later used to describe the Ark of the Covenant, which houses the presence of Yahweh in the tabernacle. And so, as the Egyptian gods had their image in an ark, Yahweh is preserving his image, namely through his image bearers, which are humans made in the image of God, and in this case referring to Noah's family, in his ark. And if you were to think back to the creation account, where was the first place God's presence was seen? In the Garden of Eden. In Eden, God created a sacred place where his creation, both animals and humans, live in harmony. And now this ark becomes the place where the new creation, where both animals and humans will live together. In other words, although God is destroying this earth with a flood, he is restoring his creation and recreating it through this sacred space, namely the ark. Later we see in Genesis chapter 7 verse 20 that the waters prevailed above the mountains so that all you have left is sky and sea. This recalls Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, where the earth was without form and void, leaving only water and sky. Later, God made a wind to blow over the earth so that the water can subside, which recalls Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, where the Holy Spirit hovered over the waters in creation. By the way, the Hebrew word for breath and spirit is the same word, and so we see a connection there as well. Then when the flood finally subsides, we see dry land appear, which corresponds to the creation account, when dry land appears as the waters were gathered. Finally, God commanded Noah and his family to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth. And this is a repetition of God's commandment to Adam and Eve. In fact, the name Noah means to rest. And this word first appears back in Genesis chapter 2 verse 15, when it says that God took Adam and he Noah'd him or rested him in the garden. And so we see that the Noahic Covenant is described with language that would take the reader back to the creation account. And like a movie director repeating the same scene, we see that is what is going on here. And so the Noahic Covenant is the beginning steps of God's restoration plan to quote-unquote start over and recreate this earth with a new human population. In fact, the restoration plan concept continues with the Exodus story, where God reveals his power to restore creation. We know about the 10 plagues that God performed in Egypt, but if you were to look at it carefully, you will notice that 3 plagues deal with the water, 3 plagues deal with the land, and 3 plagues deal with the sky, with the final plague dealing with Pharaoh's son. And so the 3 categories of water, land, and sky recalls back to the same 3 categories we see in the creation account. And so the purpose of the 10 plagues in Egypt was to show that Yahweh is the creator God and not the different idols of Egypt. We see this restoration plan continue in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 44, God reveals that he will appoint Cyrus to deliver Israel from Babylonian exile. And then in Isaiah chapter 44, verses 24 to 28, God confirms his promise by recalling his power in creation by repeating certain phrases from Genesis 1 to 2 here. For example, the phrase, "Who made all things?" or "Who alone stretched out the heaven?" recalls the creation account. Isaiah also quotes from the flood narrative with the phrase, "Dry up your rivers" in Isaiah chapter 44, verse 27, which goes to the flood account. And so by pointing to the creation account and flood account, Isaiah is saying that God's creative power will be used to restore Israel back from the Babylonian exile. Later in Isaiah chapter 50 verse 2, God reiterates his intention to deliver Israel by recounting his mighty acts from the flood and Exodus stories. "Behold, by my rebuke I dry up the sea, I make the rivers a desert. Their fish stink for lack of water and die of thirst." Again, this is language referring back to the flood and Exodus story. Later in Isaiah chapter 51, we see how God alludes to his power in creation, the flood, and the Exodus as evidence of his power to restore Israel and to bring them back to Jerusalem. Specifically, in Isaiah chapter 51 verses 10 through 11, we see language that alludes back to the flood and Exodus accounts. See if you can notice it. Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to pass over? And the ransom of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their head. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. Do you notice the phrase, the waters of the great deep, closely resembles the language of the flood from Genesis chapter 7 verse 11? And then do you notice the phrase Passover, which recalls the Exodus story or the Passover? And we know that the Exodus story is the climax of Israel's redemptive history. And this is echoed with God predicting a new Exodus where he will bring his people out of Babylon and back to their land again. So what does the creation, the flood, and the Passover story have in common? According to Isaiah, these three events illustrate God's power to restore creation, and we know that the Noahic Covenant is the first domino to fall in this process. In Isaiah chapter 55 verses 10 through 11, we see that God reverses the imagery of water since he connects the certainty of his word with the imagery of water that brings a harvest on the earth. This goes back to the flood story. Just as Noah's dove served as a messenger that returned with an olive leaf as a sign of a restored new world, so too would God's word return with an everlasting sign of a restored new creation, namely the covenant of peace. Instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress, instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle, and it shall make a name for the Lord, an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. So we see how the Noahic Covenant is the first domino in a long chain of events, namely the flood, the Exodus story, and later the Babylonian exile, that recalls the creation account where God will recreate his creation in order to restore it back to his original design. Now, how will the Noahic Covenant finally be fulfilled? Look at Revelation chapter 21 verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. Notice that the final place where believers will reside with Jesus is on a new earth. But notice something different about this new and renovated earth as opposed to the earth we currently live in. There is no sea. It does not say that there is no water, by the way, since we do see the river of life on this new earth again. However, this new earth will no longer have the oceans that we see today. Why? Because oceans were the result of the flood. Did you know that? And so in the picture of the new earth, John describes all the negative effects of sin that will be reversed with the phrase, no more. No more death, no more crying, no more pain, and no more seas, which was a reminder of the flood. In other words, God fulfills the Noahic Covenant by not only preserving this earth, but restoring it back to his original design and reversing all the effects of sin forever, including the effects that came from the flood. And so we see a picture of God's mercy with this covenant, because mercy is not giving mankind what they deserve for their sin, in this case, total global destruction. And so although God should have continued to destroy the world in every generation because the problem of sin has not been solved yet, instead God will restore creation by establishing a new heaven and a new earth that we will live on forever with King Jesus.